Hello, welcome to Unbelievable. We're back for a new term of schools debates. We are in Coventry. I am your host, Andy Kind, and today we are asking the question, is faith rational? Is it reasonable? Is it rational? I've been joined by two very clever people. To my right is Dr. Zachary Ardern, who is a research fellow in Cambridge, and to my left, Dr. Alex Carter, who is a professor of philosophy at Cambridge University. Welcome to you both. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you. Hi, hello. Yeah. Hi, Alex. Nice to be friendly, isn't it? So we're talking about faith. Is it reasonable? Is it rational? Alex, I'll start with you because it would be really nice to explain to some of the people here, some of the people watching, the difference between reasonable and rational. I think most people would assume they're just interchangeable, but they're not quite, are they?
So I'm a philosopher. I make things difficult. I don't give simple answers. Unfortunately, I apologize for that in advance. When it comes to reasonableness, I think that is arguably setting the bar quite low because there are lots of things we might consider reasonable. If you think of that able qualification or suffix, adding that to something tends to make us think, okay, well, it's possible for it to be the case. So it's possible for someone to give a reason for it.
So you could see how they got there.
Indeed. You could open up your mind to the possibility that someone could give a reason or that they've got a speculative reason that may be true but they'll never be able to establish. Whereas a rational person would have to have a particular set of reasons giving them a rationale. So they'd have a particular rationale that can be questioned and challenged and they would have to defend. Whereas a reasonable person could just say, well, maybe it's possible. You know, you haven't proven that it's impossible. So again, it's difficult to try and prove that something is unreasonable, completely unreasonable.
Okay, very good. So there's a sort of falsifiability about rationality compared to reasonableness.
I think it's subjecting itself to greater scrutiny, yes.
Okay.
And I think that's what we're trying to do here, right?
That's really helpful. Dr. Zachary Ardern, you are a believer, a theist, a Christian. So we'll start with you. We'll let you open your proceedings. Is faith not just reasonable? Because I suppose even Alex would say that, okay, faith is reasonable, but is it rational? Is faith in Christ, in this case, I suppose, rational?
Yeah, great. So I'm coming at this from the perspective of a scientist. My research is in evolutionary genomics. I study how organisms have changed over very long periods of time, but also someone with a background in philosophy. My undergrad was in philosophy and biology, and as a Christian. So I'm interested in the relationship between science and faith and the reasons we might have for one or the other or both. I would say that Christian faith is at least potentially rational, that it's the kind of thing that you can give good reasons for. What's it mean to be reasonable or rational? Basically, I'd say that a belief is reasonable or rational if it's either based on good reasons or it's in accordance with the proper functioning of our cognitive system, of our belief systems. If nothing's going wrong in the way we're thinking about this, or at least nothing's going majorly wrong. But I would say there's different definitions that philosophers will give of rational. I'd say basically whichever definition you give, I think you can make a case that religious faith and Christian faith in particular is rational. And we'll get through some of the disagreements about what kind of reasons might be sensible to give for saying that a religious faith is rational. Unless we try and put faith in a different category, the kind of category that isn't either rational or irrational. And we'll talk more about this. Now, it's important to, as I start, I just want to say that religious faith is not just about beliefs. It's not just about reasons. But I think it is important that there's at least potentially reasons for beliefs we might have. And that's because Christian faith has content. It's about something. It's directed towards something or someone that is Christ. And there's various ways in which Christian faith interacts with the world, and we'll get into some of these in the discussion.
Brilliant. That's a lovely opening statement. Now, Alex, obviously you're not a Christian, very much a party pooper at this table. You would say, would you, that Christian faith is not quite rational?
I'm a party pooper at every party I go to.
It comes across, I have to say.
So Wittgensteinians, I'm a Wittgensteinian philosopher, we defend religious faith, or most of us, or many of us, let's say many of us, defend religious faith. But most of us feel cut off from religion. Wittgenstein expressed this, I expressed this. So I hope that I'm very much open to the possibility of religion. I remember a really lovely exchange that happened between Albert Camus and Simone Weil. Simone Weil, a devoutly religious person, Albert Camus, an existentialist humanist who was not typically open to religion. And he said, everything I've been railing against is not what you're talking about. And that's what I've seen in certain forms of religion. But here's the issue. Is it religion that I'm going to be describing? So this is the real test. So am I describing a kind of philosophical spiritualism that I think is deeply meaningful and profound? Because as Zach has just pointed out, there is an aspect of Christianity that it's about something particular, something specific. And can I allude to those specifics, or am I just talking in these general terms about a defense of religion? So I challenge the idea that I'm the person at this table who's going to defend an atheistic point of view. I am, like I said, I'm not welcome at any parties, because I say that the theists and the atheists are both wrong, because they're both arguing in defense of the existence of God, which is, for me, a pointless endeavor. It's similar to arguing about the existence or non-existence of the number 8. No one's doing that. Likewise, religious belief being rational is a non-question. So what I mean by that is the asking whether religion is rational or irrational is like asking if crying is rational or irrational. Does anyone have a reason for crying except my leg hurts? Right. So, but equally, someone could not cry, and would you call that rational? Again, I don't understand what would make something like that rational. So for me, it's more a question of it being non-rational. It is what undergirds someone's experience of life as a whole. So how can my experience of the entirety of life be rational or irrational? I don't think it can be.
Okay. And there's a generous way of looking at that, because actually, on one level, what you're saying is maybe if there is a God, it's not simply a series of propositions to be adhered to?
Insofar as it's making a kind of a set of empirical claims, I would argue that at best it might be science, at worst it's superstition. But there are genuinely aspects of religion which evade that, so are not making empirical claims. And if you'll indulge me very quickly, there's one very quick example that my professor used to use of a statue of the Virgin Mary starts weeping blood. Everyone rushes to this village. This actually happened. It's happened a few times, but everyone rushes to this village, and you get 3 different reactions. The first reaction is, God has made this happen. He entered the world to bring this about. The second response is a theologian, an atheistic scientist who says, no, it's the priest is tricking everyone. There's a system been set up here, or there's rust dripping from the rafters or something. It's a trick, or it's an accident. But then there was a third response, which was a woman who just said, why shouldn't the Virgin Mary weep for the sins of the world? And notice there, she's not trying to explain it. She can't be right or wrong. There's no rationality there. But notice she wouldn't say it if the Statue of Liberty started dancing. But the theologian and the scientist would both make claims like, oh, the Hudson River is full of acid, or, David Copperfield's up to his old tricks, or God made it happen. But the deeply religious person would have nothing to say here. They might say, oh, that's interesting. But in the same way that anyone would say, oh, that's interesting. There's nothing religiously significant about it.
Yeah. It's a much more artistic way of looking at it, isn't it? It simply asks a question rather than begging a question or making a huge...
It's a kind way of putting it.
I am being kind. And I have to say, you said you're not welcome at any parties. My birthday's in December. If you'd like to come along, you're very welcome.
Someone else's birthday is in December as well.
Someone else's birthday, yes. No. We're talking about him now. Zach, do you find, to be cynical, or if I wanted to be critical, which I don't, about Alex, you might say that he's doing what footballers call playing a low defensive block, which is maybe something you don't understand. Okay. But is he being then non-committal? Is he sitting on the fence? You can respond however you want based on what he said, but I just wonder whether you might think actually we can do a bit better than saying it's neither rational nor irrational.
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between talk about religion and the abstract and vague ideas of the transcendent. There's many of those across different cultures. I think what's interesting about, at least for me, about the Christian faith is that some of the big doctrines, some of the big ideas of the Christian faith are also events. They're also events in history. They're also claims about the world. And this is important because there are also claims about us, about our nature as human beings. So maybe the four of the big ideas in the Christian faith are creation, incarnation, that God becomes human, atonement, that God redeems people, resurrection, that this one who redeemed us also rose from the dead. These are all actually claims about the history, I'd say, or claims about something that happened in the world or about the nature of the world itself. And so because of that, because these claims are particular, they're about specific things, they're not just vague and transcendent and abstract, but they're particular, I think some of them really interact with history, and they interact with the kinds of things we can think about. Did this actually happen or not? Are the reasons to think that this is true or not? And so because of that, I'd say Christian faith can be subjected to scrutiny, to rational scrutiny. One of the kind of classic statements of the Christian faith is the Apostles' Creed, which begins, "We believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth." That's the way that Christians for the centuries have started talking about the faith that they have. So Christian faith is linked with ideas. It's not just about ideas, but there's some ideas that are core, and they're not just philosophical ideas about the nature of ultimate reality, but some of these are claims about events that took place in history. And that's where I think I'll have some disagreements with Alex.
Yeah. Do you want to come to my birthday?
Well, my birthday is also in December, actually, so I might have a different...
I'm going go-karting. Mum says I can bring 6 friends. I'm up to 2 if you say yes.
Oh, I'll have to think about it.
Let's get back to the debate, please. You're distracting me. How would you feed back to what Zap has just said?
So this is an acute edge, and this is perhaps why Wittgensteinians like myself express this feeling of being cut off from religion. That maybe, so if you believe in the resurrection of Christ, how could you not be a Christian, right? As opposed to, because I'm a Christian, I must believe in it. And there's that kind of tension. But what I would say is, there are historical events in history that we can believe or not believe, right? You can doubt many events in history. It seems to me, though, these are events in history that are not to be doubted. Wittgenstein put it this way: he said, religion says, think like this, do that, right? So it's giving you a command. It's absolute. And what he says is, if you try and justify that, it becomes repellent. And he uses quite an interesting example. If anyone's ever read The Pilgrim's Progress, where Christian is trying to get to heaven, to salvation, and in the way are lots of these obstacles. And Wittgenstein says, if you imagine that God has put these obstacles in his way to test him just out of a sense of fun, or, just to see if he can, then it's a repellent story of a person like pulling puppet strings and being, and if that's the justification, it's not attractive at all. However, if you remove the justification, if you just simply say, Christian is on his way to Christendom and is struggling, right? He's struggling to get there. That's meaningful. That's profound. That's impressive. I've always, I agree with Victor Hugo that one of the best books ever written is the Book of Job. It's deeply, profoundly moving, except for the additions at the beginning and at the end. And I call them additions. I have no idea if these are additions. I'm not a scripture scholar, but they feel like additions. Why? Because if it's a story of Job suffering these awful things, it's going to happen to lots of us. And him asking God at the end, why is this happening to me? And God throwing back, why is there a sun? Why is there a Friday? Why do fish swim in the sea? I don't know what you're asking me to explain to you. G.K. Chesterton expresses this by saying, the riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. And what's interesting about that story is, in between those, his suffering and his travails and his getting nothing from God in way of explanation, are these attempts to explain it by human beings. And people offering these theological style explanations. Oh, you did something wrong, you should have done this. If you did this, you'll be removed from this curse. None of it consoles him and none of it works. And you could imagine Richard Dawkins perhaps going to him and saying, oh, don't worry, there is no God. Do you think that makes Job feel any better? No, of course it doesn't. It doesn't console him either. So what I'm saying is the profound change that happened to Job was his confronting the fact that there's no explanation. That I am, that is simply just an expression of the end of explanations. And that's not an explanation. That's just the fact that we are desperate to try and find an answer, and sometimes there just won't be one. And so that's where religion steps in. And that's why I say, if you don't have religion in your life, you are in some ways impoverished. if you don't have science in your life, you're also impoverished because you can't do those things of explaining the everyday. So they're just different modes of engaging with the world. And again, this is a point on which myself and Zachary will disagree, because I've never had to wrestle those two things to try and get them together. I can just stand above it all as a philosopher, immune from this as some sort of, kind of dispassionate observer. If I actually had to engage with these things, wrestle with these things directly, then maybe I would get caught up in the particulars. But I hope that I have gained a kind of perspective by being removed from these things. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't. Again, we can get into
armchair analysis type of thing.
Yeah, but I detest the kind of ivory tower philosophers. The thing that Bertrand Russell once said, most people would rather die than think, and most people do. And it's a really unpleasant kind of philosophizing. It's quite funny, but it's not pleasant. Yeah. And it's disdainful, and it's rejecting of and that's that. Once someone said to me, your philosophy of religion is very interesting for smart people, but I don't think I can understand it. I think it just goes over my head. It's too difficult. And I said, you've just defeated my argument. And he went, what do you mean? I said, well, religion has to be accessible to everyone. And if I am explaining a religion that can only be accessed by left bank philosophers of the 20th century, like Simone Weil and Albert Camus, then I'm sorry, this isn't a theology that anyone can embrace. Yeah. So again, I hope I'm not that kind of ivory tower armchair pundit.
No.
I am trying to attend to this. But again, I feel like churches don't yet offer people that, because they are offering them something else. They're meeting people's wants rather than people's needs. And I feel like what I get from Simone Weil's theology, from this deeper understanding of what I would call a deeper understanding of religious belief, is that potential to be sustained, that potential to be consoled. So I'm not consoled in the way that Job is consoled, but I recognize the potential to be.
Mm. And I think it's certainly true as someone myself who is a Christian. I think there's ideas that you can agree with, and there is that sort of reasoning towards a rationale, which I think Christians do, and there's comfort in reaching a belief, there's comfort in reaching a resolve. But I think also the Christian faith, does it not, Zach, has that more holistic, whole body, whole soul approach. Actually, there is that idea of relationship with God that you can have, that is not simply an idea to be subscribed to. I don't want to take you off on a tangent if you've got something to hit back at Alex with, because I know you guys have been talking a lot of the morning. So really, I think what we want is to get into some serious area of disagreement here.
Yeah, so I think it's important that faith is not just belief. That I would say faith is about personal trust. But also, I would say you can have rational or irrational faith. And I want my faith to be rational. I want it to be, if there's reasons in the world that I should consider that are touching on things my faith talks about, I should consider those things. So when the Bible says that, and Christian theology says that God is the creator of everything, and I'm a scientist, I want to understand, what does that mean for me as a scientist? And I think this idea has been really important in the history of science. The idea that Christians have a faith in a rational creator who created a world that we can understand. This has been really important. I'm a big fan of a guy called Asa Gray, who was Charles Darwin's closest friend in America and largest supporter. And Asa Gray was a professor of botany at Harvard, and he was a Christian. And he was thinking about, what does evolution mean for my faith? And he has a nice quote, faith in order, which is the basis of science, cannot reasonably be separated from faith in an ordainer, which is the basis of religion. So for him, the one who created the laws of nature is the reason that we have a rational world that we can study through science, but it's also the doctrine of creation, that these things go together, that it's not, you have your scientific stuff here, and then these other separate religious claims. I see them as intersecting. A lot of people through the history of science, some of the great scientists, like Asa Gray, but also many others, have seen science and religion not as separate, but science as fitting within a religious framework. So that's one of the advantages of Christian faith, is that it gives you a personal relationship with Christ, but also it gives you holistic framework for not just relationship, but also for understanding, which I find really useful as a scientist. It gives me some grounding for my faith that the world is rational and worth studying.
So we'll stay with you though, Zach. So Alex's approach of taking a very honourable, detached view and being able to observe from a height, if you like, would you say that that is a mistaken approach? Is he missing something by taking that stance?
Well, I think I think he's missing some of the distinctiveness of Christian faith, which is that it makes claims not just about God and theology, but that these things are also about humankind and about us. And that's why I think actually the doctrine of creation is really important. That's why it makes sense to worship God. One of the main reasons it makes sense is that God has created us, and it's appropriate to respond to our Creator. He's not just a distant creator, but also a creator who speaks. And that's why the Bible is a source of authority for Christians, because this God who created us has also spoken about us, about who we are and about who he is and about what we should do in the world. So the distinctiveness of Christianity, I think, is largely in particular things that actually happened or didn't happen. It doesn't make sense to be a Christian if Jesus never existed. It doesn't make sense to be a Christian if Jesus died but didn't rise. The Apostle Paul says that in 1 Corinthians. So there's stuff that either happened or didn't happen, and it's reasonable to try and work that out. Maybe these are things we can't work out, but I think we can have a good conversation about, is there some reason to think this stuff actually happened or not? And does it help me to make sense of the world? Does it fit with the other things I want to do, like science in my case? And I find a really close connection there, where my science fits really nicely within the broader framework of Christian faith.
Yeah, brilliant. Alex?
So what I think we might be muddling here as well, though, is around what grounds faith in general and what you have faith in specifically. So, for instance, Wittgenstein tried to capture certain phenomena that were unique to religious belief in general. Things like the feeling of perfect safety, which does not mean I won't be harmed. It means even if I'm harmed, it's okay. This was a person who had this expression. He experienced this idea just before going off to fight in the First World War. And you could imagine that being highly galvanized in his thinking. He also talks about, wonder that there is a world at all, as opposed to, I wonder why the sky is blue. And then scientists will explain it. I'll get the explanation. The wonder goes away. But wondering, why is there anything at all? I get an explanation. I'm still going to wonder. I've still got to have that sense of wonder. So, but when it comes to like the reasonableness or the rationality of faith, for me, there are two important themes. There's the point that Simone Weil makes where she says, my faith is not based on a historical anecdote. If they rolled the rock away and Jesus's body was still in there, then that's not the basis of my faith. That wouldn't destroy the basis of my faith, but it would mean that it's all for nothing. Which is, it would be like detaching a limb. It would be like desperately seeking for something, for there to be a religious faith and not being able to attach it to anything. So again, it's this kind of the attitude, the undergirding of it. At the same time, the very specific beliefs that you might have might be expressed through certain actions. And again, I realize that I'm sort of turning this more to a kind of an action focus rather than a historical or scientific focus. But for instance, I think people can misunderstand their own beliefs, which I know is an incredibly unpopular viewpoint. Again, like I said, not many parties. So for instance, if I say to someone, why do you pray? They might say, because maybe this is what they've been told in the past, or maybe they're just responding in the moment and they think that I'm expecting a certain answer, and they say, because I think the prayer will bring about change in the world. I'm praying for world peace because I think it will cause world peace to happen. And I say to them, okay, then I think that's a superstition, goodbye. Alternatively, though, I could say to them, can I suggest to you an alternative interpretation? And again, you're welcome to reject this, and I have had people reject this, but can I suggest to you that the reason you're praying is because you're expressing the grief that there isn't world peace, that you're expressing grief that the world is the way it is. And then they might say, oh yeah, sorry, why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I think of that as my reason? Yeah, that's exactly why I'm doing it. I don't think it has a cause and effect relationship. And by the way, this comes out a lot in how scientists approach things. So again, here I am picking on scientists. I don't do this rarely. I like scientists. I live in Cambridge. I have to.
And you like Zach? That comes
very fond of Zach. More than just Christian love there. This is a real bond. Anyway, but I'm very supportive of Zach in what he does as a scientist. I like science. It's very important, but it's not everything. And scientism is the bigger problem for me. An attitude where you assume science explains everything. A good example of this, I've just moved into a cemetery in Cambridge, and there's two prominent people buried there. One is my philosopher of choice, Wittgenstein. I know it's very on brand, it's very pathetic, I'm sorry. The other is James Fraser, who was a very famous anthropologist from Cambridge, who wrote The Golden Bough. In The Golden Bough, he talks about a rain dance. And if you go up to anyone in the street and say, what is a rain dance? They will say almost something on the variation of, it's dancing in order to make it rain. Wittgenstein read his Golden Bough and noticed in the text that he said it himself. They only dance in the rainy season. They do this in October when the rains are expected. They don't do it during a drought. They don't do it when the crops are dying. They do it when it's the rainy season. So Wittgenstein says, wouldn't the more appropriate interpretation of that dance be that they're celebrating the rain? And the thing is, James Fraser wasn't blind to this stuff. Imagine him going to his nephew's birthday party and everyone starts singing Happy Birthday, which I won't sing because it's copyrighted, but they don't care about copyright, so they start singing Happy Birthday. And imagine him then saying, oh, look, they're singing Happy Birthday in order to make him older. Right? No one in our society would think that's why we sing Happy Birthday. So why did he assume it about this tribe? Now, there are people, though, that dance in order to make it rain. That is what I would call superstition. Dancing to celebrate the rain, I would call religious. That's how I'm trying to, almost as an anthropologist. Yeah. So again, not completely disinterested. But I recognize their passion. I'm myself not passionate. Yeah. I don't dance when it rains. I hide.
Yeah, wow. We don't have the time to dissect maybe the bizarrest sentence I've ever heard from anyone, where you said, I've just moved into a cemetery.
Yeah, it's an unusual thing for a living person to utter, I know here.
Kind of true crime for anyone, unfortunately, and this is not that. We don't have very much time before we go to questions. So, Zach, leave the cemetery. Don't worry about the cemetery thing. We'll ask him that over lunch. Apply your thoughts to what Alex has just said.
Well, on the theme of cemeteries,
I just said.
I mean, so Christian doctrine touches on some events: creation, incarnation, God becomes human, atonement, somehow God dies, resurrection, somehow this person rises from the dead. So for me, this historical question of whether that tomb was empty is important and is religiously significant. And so there's facts in the world that can point beyond themselves. You can do that with science, but it's much kind of, it's things like fine-tuning. The universe is set up in a very nice way. And that can be kind of a pointer, a hint beyond itself. The idea that it looks like the universe had a beginning, that was very surprising to atheists when this was discovered. And some, including Fred Hoyle in Cambridge, pushed back very strongly against this. He really hated the idea that the universe had a beginning. So there's stuff in the world that can point beyond itself. But for Christians, the most significant stuff in the world was the stuff around the life of Jesus, which is a bizarre claim. It's very strange. But if it's true, I think it's profound that if Jesus did rise from the dead, and if he is if that is just a foretaste of what's available to us, then that actually has massive significance, that God is interested in the world, that he's interested in remaking the world, and that's something that we can actually be part of. So I guess I just want to emphasize that for Christians, as I see it, there is a connection between stuff that happens in the world and what God is like and what he's doing in the world. And I guess I'd maybe if there's time, we could talk a little bit about can we take this stuff seriously from a historical perspective?
Yeah, well, let's have at that now, and then in a few moments' time, we'll start to ask for some questions. So if you guys could have your questions ready, but yeah, let's touch on, if it's okay with you guys, the historicity of Scripture, which is a real pillar for Christian belief. We believe it's the Word of God and can be relied upon, can be trusted. So have at it.
Yeah, so as well, I think that the four Gospels we find in the Bible are broadly reliable accounts of Jesus' life. And I happen to know that Alex doesn't agree with that, but I think it's worth discussing why that is. Because there's all kinds of objections that people can raise to this. But if they are, then I think they're highlighting some stuff in the world that is really challenging to some worldviews and really fits with the Christian faith. So there's stuff that either happened historically or didn't, that if it did happen, I think is really significant. So if that tomb was empty, and if people saw Jesus alive, and if he did do miracles, then that's reason to reject some worldviews that people have, various other religions, atheism, naturalism, and reason to take Christian claims seriously. So I'm curious to hear from Alex, what's your response to that?
Come on, Alex.
Well, I'll channel Hume in a second and give his response to it. But I would just pick up Andy's words initially, just because Andy said, let's talk about the historicity of the Bible. And said, we believe it's the word of God and we trust it. No historian says that about any source. So you're not a historian. That's not history.
Well, so plenty of historians are Christian and would say that about the Bible, but they're not doing history and doing that. So there are different things. So the inference...
If I was a Zoroastrian and I told you that there's certain things about the universe that I know to be true, you wouldn't say, well, therefore you're a cosmologist.
Sure.
Because I'm a Zoroastrian and I hold certain views about this stuff, right? Astrology isn't accepted just because lots of people might say that's how I view the universe.
Yeah. So is there a firmer basis for Christian faith than there is for Zoroastrianism or for astrology? And my wife is an astronomer, not an astrologer. They often get confused. But I think that the real grounding in the world is important for historical faiths like the Christian faith. And I just don't see good reasons to reject the Gospels and the book of Acts, which are about the history of the early church, as substantive, at least attempts at history, which can be corroborated with various facts that we should take seriously as historical documents. But Alex disagrees. I'm curious.
But that's what makes me suspicious, right? Yeah. Is that, again, no one says that in history, that I don't see any reason why we can't trust this as a source. Literally every source can be given reasons why it's untrustworthy. Sure, Plato's dialogues are untrustworthy about Socrates, and I'm a philosopher and I hold these to be very important. In fact, actually, what I would argue about Plato's dialogues is that they prove that he's the worst student who ever lived, because Socrates hated the written word precisely because he was afraid that his words would be separated from him himself. And what did Plato do? He turned it into his mouthpiece. But I could imagine those being used as gospel evidence of him having these conversations with these certain people. They're historical, they're written down, they were done at the time, but no one trusts them as historical documents. Even in philosophy, even Platonists would be like, well, no, you don't trust them as that, they're fiction. So we don't know why the Gospels were written in the way they were, but I can guarantee they were because the people writing them were interested in telling a particular narrative. So there's one reason not to trust them, and I can go on forever about reasons not to trust the gospel.
Yeah, so anyone who writes a biography will have reasons for why they wrote a biography about this person and not the man down the street who also had an interesting life in their own way.
That's not what I said. That's not what I said.
Everyone who writes about history...
If I wrote a biography of my father, that would be different from me writing a biography about any other person.
Sure. So anyone who writes a biography has reasons for doing this biography rather than another. This is true for all history. But historians are not radical skeptics, right? They do accept that some things probably happened or did not happen in history. And then the fact that something is not, I think there's often a dichotomy between proof or absolute belief or something you can be absolutely certain about and stuff you have no reason to believe. Most of stuff is in the middle somewhere.
Rationality requires criticality. So if you are unwilling to consider the possibility that they're untrustable sources, you aren't trusting those sources because you are just blindly trusting them. That's not trust. Bear with me. For instance, if someone said, I have autonomy, and I say, well, what about the doctors saying you don't have autonomy? They say, no, they're just absolutely wrong. I would trust that person less than if they said, look, I totally understand the reasons why they think I don't have autonomy. I get it. I'm passionate about this. My mother died of the same disease and it means a lot to me. And I'm really, really hurt by what they're saying. But I really strongly feel that this is not the right path for me. That person, I would say, has autonomy because they're conflicted. They recognize a tension and they can still pick a side. It's not about not picking a side, but they recognize a tension. That is what historians do.
Yes,
it's maligning historians to say that there are some sources they just simply trust.
So I've never
simply trust them.
So I never said they simply. I never said those words, right? That historians simply trust. The question is whether they can trust them. There's often a dichotomy between faith and belief. But there's a section in the Gospels where someone says, "I believe, help my unbelief." There's this idea that you can believe in part, but need help to believe more thoroughly. And I think we're actually on the same page here. So it might seem like we're disagreeing, but actually historians are not in the business of certainty. But where I disagree with Alex is I'm not sure Christians need to be in the business of certainty either. Okay,
but this is where I would find like a really powerful core of religion. Sorry, the reason I'm saying this is because I'm conscious of time, and I just really wanted to make this point. Like Simone Weil.
I like it though. The game was really opened up. It's end to end.
Good. You're enjoying this as a football spectator. Okay. So Simone Weil says, I want a faith based on certainty, not on what we force ourselves to believe. She actually says the root of all evil is daydreaming, is wishing the world was one way, not another. I encountered this, forget Christianity, I encountered this with someone at a creativity retreat, where I said the eternal return of the same by Nietzsche suggests that we could repeat our lives over and over and over again. And that psychological test means, can you embrace all of your life? Every embarrassment, every failed exam, every silly thing you've ever done in your life, right? All those sorts of things. Can you embrace all of it together at once and say yes? Or do you want to tinker? Do you want to change it, right? And what she then said to me was, oh, no. Well, the eternal return, I find it more appealing to think of it as a spiral, that we're getting closer and closer to a point. I said, but what does that add? You've just taken the image and just presented a new image that undermines it. So my point is, what Simone Weil is conveying is a completely different conception of what faith would be that can win over atheists. She even says it's a path to faith through atheism, is to recognize that we can have certain things that we know to be the case. One very quick example, just in case, because I know examples help, is the desire for gold is not gold. The desire for bread is not bread. The desire for good is itself good. And she also makes this point, these very spiritual, interesting points, that the desire, that if you hunger for bread and you desire bread, you're not given stones. You might not be given bread, but you're never given stones. What she's saying is, if you desire truth, if you hunger for the truth, you don't typically get lies. This is what she's saying is intellectual honesty means gripping onto certainty and accepting that we have to embrace certainty. Some people have said to me, how can faith be certain? Surely it has to be a kind of throwing out into an unknown. Not true. I have faith that 2 + 2 = 4. Right? So you can have faith in things that are certain. So the point she's getting at here is that there's these two diverging pathways for faith. One is force myself to believe something that's comforting, that I want to be true, because that's the only other thing beyond evidence. Or it's go with the evidence, which again I think is also paucity, because it doesn't lead to anything that can undergird one's life. Or take a pathway towards certainty. And I feel like that cannot be watered down, it cannot be sacrificed. It has to, it's got to be everything.
Great, well, that's wonderful. We're going to move into some questions now. Thank you, Dr. Zachary Ardern and Dr. Alex Carter.
Pretty much universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
It's amazing how quickly ostensible deontologists transform before our very eyes into utilitarians on this question. We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms. The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. The difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here. This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online, so thanks again.
There's lots of things there that we could tap into. It's always very tantalizing in these schools debates because we've got two very knowledgeable people who I'm sure could go to great depths in every single one of those storylines that we started, but we have to keep it fairly surface level because of the time. So questions from the audience then, please raise your hands. Who has a question? Okay, so we've got a question, I suppose, about God's goodness. If God has a plan for everybody, and this is directed to Dr. Zachary Ardern. What about people who seem to be figuratively going through hell? What's the plan there?
So I think the question was about people who are going to hell. Is that so? There's a
Right,
a claim about
that's a very different question.
the idea of whether God can judge, whether that can be eternal. Christians disagree on this. There's different pictures of. So a famous Christian writer, C.S. Lewis, has this idea that many people who don't seem to be on the right path actually get included. So he's an inclusivist in some sense. I'm inclined to what's called annihilationism, big word, that people either live or die, and that death is eternal. So I think this is the picture that the Bible teaches, that life is conditional, that life is on offer through Jesus. And maybe some people, there's various ways that God might include that. But ultimately, if life is given to you, it's through Jesus. That's what I take the Christian to be. And the alternative, I think, is death or perishing. But this is controversial and difficult, and I'm not a theologian. But I think there's a tension in the world, whatever your worldview, between good and evil, and where does justice fit between that? What does justice look like? Does justice embrace evil? Does it dissolve evil? Does it exterminate evil? And actually, Christians have taken slightly different paths through that. But I think actually for me, theologically, the main point is the goodness of creation, that God is good, he's made a good world, and he loves this world. And so any judgment is not the main story. The main story is actually God's goodness and offer of life. And the alternative is something that we actually don't have great insight into, and the Bible doesn't talk that much about the details of. I think the emphasis is the goodness of creation because it was made by a good God. And yet it's also broken. There are major problems with the world, and there needs to be a way to deal with that. And obviously the Christian story also has a story about how that is dealt with.
And C.S. Lewis, of course, wrote a book called The Great Divorce, where they take people who are currently in hell on a day trip to heaven, and they're allowed to stay at any time. But they all come up with reasons why they don't want to. And there's that phrase from the book, the gates of hell are locked from the inside. So the idea, and again, Lewis was not the most conservative guy in his thinking, but I probably agree with him that the idea that heaven or being in the presence of God for eternity is opt-in. It's not simply a driving test where you get a series of minor faults and then eventually you get a major fault and that's game over. It's an offer that we can accept or deny. I don't know whether you've got anything.
I have strong views on this. So on the I was talking about agency before, and the nature of agency is that we live perpetually in tension. When do you feel most free? When you don't want to make the decision, right? That's when you feel. There's a passage from St. Paul's letter to the Romans 9:21. I can quote scripture
Well done.
occasionally, which is God has made you a vessel of wrath or a vessel of grace, and yet you are responsible. And for me, this sums up this exact problem. And religion is meant to be difficult. If religion offered easy answers, I suspect it wouldn't be worth having. So the whole point is that it's meant to present you with this tension of you've been made a certain way, you've been set on a certain path, and yet you are responsible for that. That's a really difficult. It's not logically contradictory, by the way. Just speaking as a philosopher, that's not a logical contradiction. So that is possible, that you can be made to be a certain way and responsible for being that way. So this also speaks to that notion of agency, that it actually does take orientation of self and this kind of desire to be a certain way, and recognizing that, for instance, the desire for good is itself for good could be one way to sort of pull you out of that temptation of that path.
Wonderful. That's great. Thanks, Vas. Any other questions? Yes, we have a question over here. Okay, so we've got a question that we have heard before, and because it's a very important question. If we're talking about a good God who's created a good world, he saw that it was good. Yet we do find that there's suffering, gratuitous suffering. So how would, I'll give Zach time to answer that, but we'll start with Alex, just because you were taking too big a swig, really.
No, it's fair. That's fair.
So how, as a philosopher who's slightly, aloof, how would you talk about squaring the so-called goodness of God with the very tangible evil and suffering in the world?
Again, this applied approach to religion, I think, has offers of two different pathways, right? You've got the apologetics route of you try and offer justifications for why evil happens. I had a professor once who said those things don't so much justify evil as contribute to it, suggesting that a child of 9 has leukemia in order to teach that child a lesson or its parents a lesson is vile and should never be uttered by any human being. I feel quite strongly about that, sorry.
Yeah.
However, I think there is a beautiful pathway opened up from people who have suffered. There was a philosopher, Diogenes Allen, who had terrible pain from cancer, and he remembered two things. He remembered a word that his mother got him to intone as a child, which was hupomone, which means endure. And just uttering that word helped him through. So that was one thing. Another thing was he recognized that the love of God happens not despite suffering, but because we suffer. That's a non-apologetic response. I personally find that considerably more profound than the appeal to, oh, don't worry, it's all okay, God's on our side. As one Wittgensteinian philosopher put it, if I believe in God in order not to be blasted into pieces, then I should hope I would have the decency to say, go ahead and blast. Right? If I can't be better than the religion that I'm supposed to be subscribing to.
Yeah.
And I'm not a good person. I hope that everyone would recognize their own wretchedness and original sin. My original sin was studying Wittgenstein, maybe, but or philosophy as a whole. But basically, that I recognize that I'm not a good, but I still am better than that.
Yeah.
So I don't find apologetics very appealing.
Live in a graveyard. You're punished.
It's the only people who will live with me, and my long suffering.
But it's the question of would a God who sends people to a literal hell, is that God actually worthy of worship? I suppose that's the question.
Well, that was picked up in both questions, I guess, is this idea. Yeah, is ultimate condemnation fair, right? And there are philosophers like Galen Strawson who says we don't have that kind of free will. We don't have a heaven and hell responsibility. It doesn't make sense to talk about that. Unfortunately, we can't help that. In fact, his father, P.F. Strawson, wrote a very famous paper, which I think is fantastic, about how we can't help that. Forgiveness is a secondary quality. You have to be angry at someone to forgive them. There's a beautiful line by Zizek that says, this is a false dichotomy. Should you be racist or tolerant? He said, tolerant implies you're already racist, but you got over it. So maybe the better thing would be to not be racist in the first place. Right, so that's why that's a false. And again, similarly, forgiveness versus pity. Pity is an immediate reaction that we have to someone. Forgiveness is a secondary quality. So pity you can feel, but that requires someone to be an agent, someone to be recognized as a human being. To forgive someone all their misdeeds would have to be a secondary quality that we'd have to think about.
Yeah.
Anyway, you can tell my PhD was on free will. Sorry, I talk a lot about it.
I know, spoke about it so well. We've only got a couple of minutes left, Zach, so we'll give you some time. We'll make this the last question. How do you want to respond?
And this is obviously one of the big questions to the history of philosophy, to the history of theology. And I'm not a theologian. I'm not a professional philosopher. But I think the Bible addresses this in a few places and never does actually try to give an explanation. So, and usually I'm a fan of explanation. I think so I disagree with Alex, and I think part of religion is about explaining the world. But Christianity doesn't really seem to be trying to explain evil. It's a thing that is in the world that is real and that God is against. And it's a weird paradox. How is it that God is against it, but he's all powerful and yet it's still here? There seems to be an answer that, well, it's not always going to be here, that God is going to destroy it in the end. But there's not a robust explanation about why it's here in the first place. And I think the Bible just doesn't give that kind of answer. Jesus was asked at one point, why did this tower fall on these people? And he didn't say it was because he rejected the idea it was because these were bad people, which is one response that people can give. He said basically it's God's will, and he didn't give an explanation about why this thing happened. The book of Job, again, it doesn't give an explanation. So whenever evil is addressed, it's seen as something that is there and it's bad and God is going to deal with it, but there's not an explanation of why it's there. So I can't give one. There's different attempts that people have made, but they're all only partial at best. And it is really problematic to to try and give an explanation of something where we haven't been given the reason.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for watching Unbelievable. It's been a really good debate. We scratched the surface and no more than that, as we always do. But I hope whether you're watching at home or you're watching here in the room, you'll be aware that we've asked the question, is faith rational? We have two people here who disagree on the ultimate meaning of life, but are insanely intelligent and are really keen to be rational and to use reasons to get to their rationale. Hope you appreciate that. Hope it has given you food for thought as you continue to go on this journey through life and search for meaning. We'll be back on Unbelievable soon. If you want to come to my birthday party, go-karting. We're meeting at the cemetery to pick Alex up. Jelly and ice cream for afterwards, but there are no goodie bags because plastic is not good for the environment. Goodbye.